I'm Tamas Kemenczy. I'm part of Cardboard Computer, the folks who are making Kentucky Route Zero. Yesterday at the Mild Rumpus thing, we did a sort of casual technical deconstruction of some of the visual tricks in the game. So I guess in comparison, this talk is going to be more of it's going to be an attempt at more of a formal deconstruction of the art direction. Specifically how we go about building like environments, but with like theater in mind. And so I'm going to try and step back and do this from the perspective of theater design instead of game design as a sort of exercise. So last year, Jake did a talk on how he moved away from designing puzzles and moved towards designing mysteries, and how he moved away from designing environments that kind of house mechanistic puzzles to like environments that present theater. So like in our research of set design, which has been kind of like an ongoing process, we encountered the term scenography. And like scenography is apparently not set design. Instead, it's like summarily described as designing for performance. So it's kind of vague in describing a medium or like a realm or like how you maybe go about designing or like what the design is, but like specific in being something about performers or being reactive to performers. And so the idea originates in theater, but has been applied to a lot of things. Like some of the examples that I found were just like TV and movie sets and trade shows and music events and art exhibits, performance art, and that sort of thing. So there's like this implication that the performance happens in some sort of space, like a visual space that we can occupy. And I guess surely we can use it to talk about simulated spaces or virtual spaces like a video game. So Pamela Howard is like a UK-based writer and educator, director and scenic designer. She wrote a book on it called What is Scenography? And she like further defines it as a seamless synthesis of space, text, research, art, actors, directors, and spectators. And so it's like a lot of things to consider all at once. It seems pretty ambitious. But she has like this emphasis on like a holistic or cohesive design approach. And she also in her book implicitly suggests like removing these watersheds in theater design practices, which is interesting from where we're coming from. So I like to borrow this train of thought and kind of examine how theater people talk about and go about like designing environments from this perspective, and use it as kind of like a way to frame like the theatrical flourishes in KRZ. So like Howard divides the dramatic space into like two parts, the dynamics of a space, which is like the geometry or the topology, like the volumes and the way things are laid out, and like the characteristics of the space, which is she defines as atmosphere. So I'm like kind of like the texture of the space, or you know the surface characteristics, or like the feeling of the space. So let's explore the dynamic part a bit. So she goes into a little bit of history, and basically frames this theater design before this moment that really interests her, and like the theater design before that is like in this kind of illusionistic tradition, from kind of echoing from the Baroque or like the Renaissance era. And so a lot of those stages from that time are very two-dimensional. They're like these very shallow stages with a lot of focus on illusionistic landscapes and paintings and cutouts. And like, you know, these illusions actually simulate depth. So when you look at the stage, you can kind of get a sense of, you can kind of see, you can kind of see this depth done through optical illusions and forced perspective and anamorphosis and stuff like that. And like also like these landscapes are like animated through like mechanistic means like cranks and bellows and pulleys and ropes and whatever they can do to animate it, like rolling waves or a sun setting and stuff like that. And these scenes are also kind of like, the scene changes are also kind of mechanized. They're like broken down and like rebuilt mid-flight. And so we can see this like an illusionistic approach in KRZ, like for example the gas station, when it's designed from a very particular angle, and there's a lot of flat like cutouts and flat geometry and like this forced perspective thing, and like the shadows are faked and cut into the geometry, and like our sunset is just like this wiggly disc being lowered in the air, etc. So we're like kind of caught up in making like an illusionistic pictorial landscape. And like the other example here is the Marquez farm, again like cutouts this like illusionistic landscape viewed from a particular angle or designed for a particular angle. And although it's like stylized, you know, like the trees and stuff like that, it's still trying to evoke this like lush feeling of foliage and stuff like that, a picturesque kind of approach. But I guess instead of cranks and bellows and pulleys and ropes, we're just using C# scripts to do this. So it's like easy to draw some similarities between like KRZ environment design and like Baroque illusion and stuff like that. And like Norman M. Klein writes about this in one of his books. So and then we can look at, I guess, more generically like the stagecraft in like that's apparent in like 2D level design in general and stuff. So I feel like it just seems intuitive from where we're standing as video game creators to make that comparison. But then like Howard also points to the specific shift that she's interested in that happened at the turn of the century, and she points out this architect, the Swiss architect and scenic designer, Adolphe Appia. I think that's, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. But he like creates this like striking, minimal, modular design that he calls rhythmic space. And he like totally strips everything down. Like these painted animated backdrops are just gone, like the illusions are gone. And we're just left with like this reconfigurable system of platforms and stairs. And so this is meant to be like this new focus on the movement of performers within that space, and especially adding depth to the stage, right? So the depth isn't simulated by some illusionistic landscape, but it's like it's actually there, and the characters can move, especially in Z space. And so like he also called these like living spaces. So this is pretty cool. I mean, like set design becomes like 3D, you know, like sculptural, and it's like no longer baked into a backdrop, right? It's like now much more in dialogue with performers. So this way of thinking about designing dramatic spaces by being responsive to movement is also like very present in video games and level design. But where the player movement might be something about like athleticism or acrobatics or parkour or deathmatch, you know, like predatory game trails and stuff, and sneakery or detective work. Like Appia's living space instead focuses on like the choreography of the movement of performers, like the blocking of them on a stage, like how they're configured and arranged and how they move and change within this limited space. And this movement is specifically to propel some kind of theatrical drama. So going back to KRZ, when we go through these dramatic spaces in the game, is very much what these spaces are also about. There's a lot of omnidirectional movement, especially in Z space. And the contour and scale of these scenes only extend enough to hold like a unit of theatrical drama or whatever. So another thing that was like really important and central to Appia was light. And electrical light started to become a thing in his day. So like it was like a commodity that just happened, and he saw it as a malleable commodity that he could use. Something that he could use to fuse together all aspects of a theater production. But like, he didn't use it to recreate like naturalism, but he used it as like a cinematic flourish, or to like suggest a mood or a shift in time, or to like direct the spectator's eye throughout the stage. And so his light was always shifting and changing. And up here right now is actually Beowulf Borit, one of the set designers we looked at really closely early on. You can see it's sped up, but you can see how the lighting kind of shifts the scene a lot and the mood. That's from Grace. So in KRZ, it became very central to us as well, both as a cinematic device, but also as a motif in Act 1. Like in the gas station, as you shift from the surface to the basement, you can see this happening as like a cinematic moment. And in the Marcus farm, we also use it cinematically to transition between different depths in the stage. Like for the foreground and then the house and then the TV and then the barn. And it's all kind of like one stage, but there's these cinematic changes. And in the mind, the light source reveals like a secondary layer of the space, you know, and it's supposed to give you a feeling of apprehension because of ghosts. So the second part of Howard's dramatic space, though, is about characteristics, like the atmosphere and the texture of the space. And so basically, like illusionistic realism is like torn down in a lot of modern theater, and all those like pulleys and bellows and cranks are like tossed, and we're left with Appia's rhythmic space as like a scaffolding, right, to work on top of. And so now we have a lot of negative space and empty space. And what's interesting is now that scenic designers actually reconstruct a different kind of reality, one that's not naturalistic and rational, but one that's like surreal and emotional. So like props and objects are no longer pieces of like a larger naturalistic setting. They become like instead emblematic or expressive of inner states and emotional themes of the performers, or even just the ambience of the space itself. For example, like outdoor and indoor spaces get blurred together to create a feeling of claustrophobia, like in the scene of in Death of a Salesman, where Lohman blames his failures as a salesman on the claustrophobia of urban sprawl. And we see this literally, we see the urban sprawl like literally colliding with his perforated home in the film. And his home is like spliced open. You can see the outside like bleeding, and or like, you know, like Beowulf board, again, a lot of the set designs that we looked at have this kind of collapses the interior and exteriors. And so this is also a reoccurring theme in KRZ too, blending exteriors and interiors. So Howard expands on this and talks about creating like a unified setting. And so this is combining the dynamics and characteristics of a space. So like combining the geometry and atmosphere, and like using one visual metaphor or emblem in the scene around which everything happens. So dramatic changes of time or location can be made with minimum movement within the scene by shifting focus in the scene instead of shifting the scenery itself, right? So like blocking, choreography, and lighting become the devices for cinematic changes here. And so props and emblems also convey atmosphere, and they speak silently to the viewer, as she says. Atmosphere and texture become like the devices to convey like estrangement, decontextualization, and nostalgia, and so on. So in KRZ, like atmosphere is very much conveyed this way. Like the gas station, the entry point to the game, is meant to look and feel like escapism, sort of. Like the visual metaphor or emblem is the gas station itself. It's this giant horse buried to its neck. You know, it's one of those theme gas stations that like draws on Art Deco and Googie and ultra-modern architecture. And these are architectural movements that like, you know, have all these like kind of utopian or like promises of the future. But on the inside, it's like raw and rattly and not modern at all, and sort of echoes like Conway's Depression-era delivery truck. And so like there's all these like conflicting time periods kind of colliding and clashing, and it kind of becomes anachronistic and sort of tragic, looking at this architecture. And again, in the Bureau of Reclaimed Spaces, the entry point to the zero is also very much about estrangement, right? So like in Act 1, you enter a cave. It's a naturalistic cave, but the first thing that you see in Act 2 is not a naturalistic cave, but like raw concrete and brick walls, a pipe organ, a river. It's pretty bizarre. And so basically, instead of showing caves, we're showing brutalist architecture. And in our research, like brutalism itself is like a really complex, misunderstood, and tragic architectural movement that's totally estranging. So I'd like to shift over to the cinematic frame, I guess. So like, yeah. So we've explored dramatic spaces in terms of dynamics and characteristics, as Howard puts it. But since we're talking about a video game environment and not a physical theater space, for us, performer and spectators start to kind of mean different things for us in KRZ. Like, they kind of collapse and become one thing, simply the video game player. And so part of this collapse, though, has to do with how we observe as spectators a theatrical event in a theater space, and how we can observe a theatrical event in a video game. So in a conventional theater space, as a scenographer, you often design for a proscenium, which is just basically means the front of the scenery. But in a video game, from a scenographic perspective, you can design for a cinematic frame, right? The spectator can be like dislodged and lifted from the seat and can move in all directions. And so the idea of a proscenium kind of changes, or maybe even drops away in some instances. So in KRZ, the characters or performers don't really move that much. Their gestural and choreographic movement is pretty sparse. And so they're sort of sculptural. But since the player is both the performer and the spectator, Appiah's ideas of the living space or rhythmic space can sort of like, I guess, abstractly be extended to the camera frame. And so the choreographic movement can become the camera's movement. So in KRZ, the frame is sometimes lockstep with the movement of the performer, and then sometimes it's actually more reactive to the dynamics of the geometry of the space, or the architecture, and the dominant axes and stuff like that. So it's like highly choreographed, just like the lighting cues that we went over earlier. And often when people talk about cinema or what's cinematic, they talk about montage cinema. And montage cinema is about like editing, right? Like it's about the cinematic edit, which has like all sorts of interesting meanings, right? Like the edit can be used to truncate and like speed up time, or it can be about building metaphors with like through a juxtaposition or through a cut, like how Kuleshov demonstrates, or it could be about using literary devices of and, then, and meanwhile to join scenes, or about using bits of film as words to construct new meaning. So the edit becomes kind of like a device to build a visual system of signs, sort of like hieroglyphs, right? But the type of cinema that we became interested is like slow cinema. And also we were looking a lot at structuralist cinema, specifically Michael Snow's Wavelength. So slow cinema focuses instead on the cinematic image itself, which is about an observation of a phenomena through time, or about making like a chronicle of a real-time experience. So like the recording of the passage of time becomes like an important thing of itself, and it kind of puts you in this more reflective state, right? And it even passes some of the kind of, it makes you kind of like an active participant in what you're watching, right? Because you're not really led along by a plot. So your eye is doing more work trying to figure out, like, you know, a lot of these images are like not very plot oriented, and they show like these chaotic images of life, and you're trying to like discern some kind of meaning. And it does other things too, but so we can draw similarities between observing theater and watching slow cinema. Both experiences are like real time and continuous, right? So like time is not truncated or sped up, and the cinema goer's experience actually becomes similar to that of like a witness. So Howard's unified setting is sort of about this real-time experience as well, right? Like she describes how like these stages are there when you enter the theater and you sit down and they're there, and you watch everything transpire in the scene, and then you leave, right? So it's there through the whole thing. So these cinematic flourishes are actually driven by shifting focus in the stage by the devices we've been talking about, like choreographic movement and shifting light and whatnot. So I guess summing up, like what scenography is you know, like designing for performance. I think there's like more clarity for us in how scenography is not necessarily about like set design or prop construction. And how it's like more of an argument for a cohesive design process that draws in more things. And like that list that Howard had is pretty long, and like you know, it's hard to like go through all of it, but like many other things in that are like important to us as well. Like text and research is like a big part of our process. And also like she talks about like how text is like you look at the shape of the words and how they get incorporated onto the stage itself. And also how you kind of, she talks about the original text that you work from for a play and stuff like that. So it's sort of like this ensemble of visual choreography and like a much more pliant way of like approaching theatrical design. And I think it like reflects like where we're coming from, Jake, Ben, and I, and a sort of collaborative process we have. So yeah, that's all I had. Any questions? Okay.
There's some great material that you've been showing. Is there any way to get a listing of?
Oh yeah, totally, yeah. This is Der Love, Der Ding. Just basically these two artists who wanted to make a Rube Goldberg machine. So, yeah.
Do you have any things you could share more about, like how you guys controlled your lighting to get those very kind of exact moods you were looking for?
I mean, a lot of it is like actually just creating this animation in Unity that like scripts lighting changes with animation curves, right? And then we just like scrub through this animation, you know. So like the player's position in the space drives those lighting changes, right? So like going up the hill, you know, that's parameterized as you know, as a 0 to 1 value of like the animation.
Thank you.
Hello. This is really tall. Did you guys use any, like, in your pre-production, did you do any storyboarding or things like that to plan out your movement?
Sort of. Like what we do is share like Blender sketches, because it's just a much more it's much more conducive to that kind of work, I think, like planning motion and like the stuff we just covered. So like we build like very simple prototypes sometimes in Blender or outlines, and then we animate the camera in there, and that's basically our storyboarding.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
So stage dynamics have a very different sort of implication within games than they do in theater by virtue of presenting a sort of a possibility space that's explored in a non-directed fashion by the player rather than used in a directed fashion by the actors. What would you say, I guess, what would you say you've learned about dealing with that in, while just sort of framing game design in these cinematic terms? It's a bit of a broad question.
Well, yeah, I mean, so like an ongoing experiment for us, right? Like the last one that we've done was like in the entertainment. So it's more explicitly about collapsing the spectator and the performer together, right? And so these cinematic changes are driven by your look action, like where you're looking, right? So like if you're kind of zone out at the table, there's a strong spotlight that appears, you know. So I don't know. I mean, it's just kind of like an ongoing process. Yeah. Yep.
Hey, how's it going? Whoa, I was really close to that thing. So the environments have such a really beautiful, like, emotional feel to them and a great mood. But I was wondering why you decided not to have faces on any of the characters.
When we did like the original art style, like they were all pretty detailed.
Yeah.
And then when we actually started bringing that material into Unity, we just realized that their faces weren't even visible. It was just like a bunch of flickering pixels. Mm-hmm. So just with the distance that we were working with, it was just it didn't make sense to have that there, you know.
That makes sense. I mean, was there something in, like, why did you want to have the characters be so far away? Was it because you wanted the scenes to kind of tell the story, or? Yeah,
we were originally thinking about this kind of like presenting this like confined stage, right?
Yeah.
So like when we started, we were definitely thinking about some sort of proscenium, right? Like where you're like kind of, you know, like you're kind of far away, like as a theater goer, like watching a stage, right?
Yeah.
And so there's like, you know, it neatly aligns with like point and click adventure games, sort of have that parallel. And we were very conscious of that parallel, right? We were like, this is great, so.
That's cool.
So this is a semi-related art question. My graphic designer friend would like to know why you didn't choose to use anti-aliasing. If it was a deliberate choice.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like, that's like a kind of nostalgic thing, right?
Just to get the pixels because you wanted the old-fashioned look.
Yeah, like those razor thin lines, you know, just like really evocative of the type of games that like we really like. So, yeah.
What kind of challenges did you face and problems did you solve when you're working with the Oculus and the entertainment?
Yeah, so like with the Oculus, it was really about depth became like this this parameter that we knew nothing about. And I think this is an experience a lot of people share when they just start, like hands-on, start working with like a VR set, you know? Like we were, especially in our game, like there's reading, right? So we were experimenting with all these different ways to present text in this environment. And like one of them was like, you know, some of them were like just showing, like recreating what we had in the actual game, and like in KRZ, where it's just like this dialogue bubble above them. But then it was just like doing this all the time. It just became really exhausting. And then we did like we tried subtitles, and then just like shifting your focus to different depths constantly is really fatiguing, right? So like what we learned, which I think a lot of people end up at, is like you want to keep what you need to focus on at the same kind of depth as much as you can. Like minimize having your eyes try and focus on something close and then far away and then back and forth, right? And even like silly little things, like when we were experimenting with that, like the text, when it was like, when we tried to simulate almost like reading something, and you could see like in between the shapes of the letters, like that would give you like nausea and stuff like that, right? Like your eye would be fighting to try and resolve the depth. So we had to just put like a dark box behind it so yeah, those are a lot of challenges in that one.
Are you going to do any more Oculus projects and experiments?
I mean, yeah, I think we're definitely interested in that, yeah. Yeah. Oh, we're done. Okay, thanks.